Less than a week after the First Battle of Savo Island, or the First Battle of the Solomon Sea, as the Japanese called it, Admiral Fletcher's carriers were back. A land-based airfield had been captured, and this installation, known as Henderson Field, would become a key target over the next 6 months. The Japanese wanted to either recapture it, or at the very least, destroy its utility to US forces, whilst the US, rather obviously, wanted to keep it operational. To say that it was vital to US efforts would be quite the understatement. Without it, the US forces would not have any air cover when the carriers had to fall back periodically to refuel, rearm, or repair, whilst it also allowed for the support and operation of much larger aircraft than the carriers could handle, such as Catalinas, as well as medium and heavy bombers. Plus, of course, United States Army Air Force fighters, all closer to the front line and thus more on call, and in more weathers, than the carriers offshore could manage. The Japanese, meanwhile, had to bring in most of their own air support from more distant islands such as Rabaul, support that was only really possible thanks to the exceptional range of many Japanese aircraft, although this did bring with it issues of pilot fatigue from the long journeys and a limited number of sorties per aircraft per day, since if the aircraft was in the air for several hours per day, going to and from, it simply couldn't be launched more than a couple of times. Whereas by contrast, a US pilot on an interception mission based at Henderson Field might only be airborne for around about an hour before coming back to rest, rearm, refuel, and then be back up again for another mission shortly thereafter. Nonetheless, in this early stage of the campaign, the carrier-based air support was still by far the larger and thus more vital component of the aerial aspect of the fighting, and so taking out the 3 US Navy carriers, the Saratoga, Enterprise and Wasp, was a key component of the Japanese counteroffensive, Operation Ka. In contrast to the formation of mostly older cruisers that Admiral Mikawa had had to hand previously, less than a fortnight after the First Battle of Savo Island, a large Japanese Navy task force was heading into the theatre with fresh troops for the land campaign. This added up to the 2 largest and most modern carriers in the Japanese Navy, and arguably the 2 most modern carriers in the world, Shikaku and Zuikaku, plus the light carrier Rugio and the seaplane carrier Chitose. Heavy surface elements included the battleship Mutsu and the battle cruisers Hiei and Kirishima, along with 12 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 30 destroyers, plus of course the troop transports and a number of auxiliary units. Land-based aircraft were also supposed to be present in large numbers, with the Japanese combat forces broadly divided into 2 heavy surface groups and a fleet carrier group, plus of course the transports and their covering forces. The idea was to locate the American carriers, destroy, or more likely cripple them with the Japanese Navy's carrier air wings, and then send in the surface units to repeat First Savo Island en masse at night, including hunting down any crippled US Navy carriers or escorts that had been foolish enough to hang around. Once the seas were clear, the troops would be landed and the heavy surface ships would provide shore bombardment to suppress Henderson Field and its garrison troops, as well as support the landings. On paper, the US Navy forces would seem to be hopelessly outnumbered. Whilst they had 3 carriers, Saratoga was a conversion whose great size only yielded an air group of roughly similar size to the much smaller Enterprise, albeit that these approximately matched the 2 Japanese Navy fleet carrier groups aboard Shikaku and Zuikaku. Wasp also carried a large air group, but was known to be very vulnerable to damage, and the slight advantage in naval air power, as Wasp's air group was larger than Rugio's, was pretty much the end of the good news. If it came down to a surface engagement, the US Navy only had a single battleship, the USS North Carolina, 5 heavy cruisers, and 2 light cruisers, both of which were Atlanta-class, and 18 destroyers. North Carolina was good, but the odds of it successfully taking on 3 capital ships at once were relatively slim. These forces were split into 3 task groups, each centred around one of the carriers, but without troop transports to cover, they were of course more mobile and of course entirely dedicated to combat, with Admiral Fletcher not scattering his carriers quite as far and wide as had been done at Midway. With the existing forces on Guadalcanal ramping up hostilities, the US Navy formations were closing on the island to provide more close air support, whilst the Japanese forces were coming down from the north at pretty much the same time. The 21st through 23rd of August thus passed with neither side actually realising that the other was on their way, despite a large number of scout and reconnaissance flights by both sides. One of Enterprise's fighters had shot down a Japanese scout plane, which told the US Navy that some form of Japanese Navy presence must have been in the area to launch it, but it also told the Japanese Navy that someone was around with fighters to make their aircraft go missing. But that level of information was really about as far as it went. This all changed on the 23rd, when a Catalina spotted the Japanese invasion convoy, prompting strike aircraft from the forces based on Henderson Field and from Saratoga to attempt to destroy it. But Admiral Reizo Tanaka had seen the flying boat, done a quick 180, and headed north again, which meant that the strike aircraft found nothing when they arrived over the expected coordinates. This in turn preserved the troop transports for the minute, but it meant that they were now quite far behind schedule. Faced with no sign of significant Japanese Navy warship presence at this time, and with a troop convoy that appeared to have made a run for it, Fletcher kept in mind the intel he'd received earlier, which read, "Indications point strongly to enemy attack in force on Cactus area 23rd to 26th of August. From available intelligence, presence of carriers possible but not confirmed. Important, fueling to be conducted soonest possible, and if practicable, one carrier task force at a time, retiring for that purpose." As it now appeared that any such force might be running towards the latter end of that particular calculation, Wasp, along with her escort, 7 destroyers plus 2 heavy and 1 light cruiser, were sent off to refuel, leaving Saratoga, Enterprise and their air groups and escorts in proximity to the islands. This was unknowingly shaping up to be round 3 of the US Navy versus Japanese Navy carrier battles, and Fletcher's own personal rematch with Nagumo. With the final balance of forces set, the 24th of August saw Ruggio move forward to launch a strike on Henderson Field. This was designed to serve 2 purposes. Firstly, and most obviously, the suppression of the US aircraft that were based there, which would reduce their ability to hit back. It would also draw attention to the smaller carrier and its escort group, which would hopefully distract American efforts from noticing the 2 much larger fleet carriers coming up behind it, which in turn were primed and ready to launch a massed strike the moment the US fleet revealed its position. For their parts, US forces, both flying boats and carrier aircraft, were launching multiple reconnaissance missions themselves. Enterprise would launch almost 24 aircraft for this purpose, and by early afternoon they'd spotted every single Japanese formation except the carriers. It appeared to be a massive attempt to retake Guadalcanal, with only a single light carrier for air support, outside of course of long-range air support missions from Rabaul. For the US Navy, it seemed too good to be true, and as a result Admiral Fletcher was deeply suspicious. He couldn't ignore the chance to take out an enemy carrier, even a small one, with what seemed to be overwhelming American air superiority, but he also didn't fully believe that this would be all the Japanese Navy was sending to cover such a large surface formation. Thus, just after lunchtime, he sent about half of Saratoga's strike aircraft off after Ruggio, but would keep the bulk of his aircraft, including all of Enterprise's air group, back, just in case. Ruggio's limited air group duly pressed on to Henderson Field, but between the base's own fighters, its air defences, and the fact that a much larger and heavier strike force from Rabaul that was due to join up with the Japanese strike had been forced back by bad weather, but hadn't actually told the Ruggio, the 6 bomb-equipped Kate carrier-based bombers accomplished fairly little, apart from losing half their number to US defences. Whilst that battle was unfolding, a Japanese scout finally spotted the Saratoga and Enterprise. Albeit that it was the last thing that particular scout would ever do, the pilot's final report nonetheless arriving in early afternoon and prompting the launch of 2 successive waves of aircraft, each containing 27 dive bombers with escorting fighters. In addition, the heavy surface forces picked up speed, aiming to hit the US forces as planned at night and destroy any survivors. As this happened, a couple of US scouting aircraft finally managed to spot the Japanese carriers and launched an attack after sending in a report. The attack itself only managed a near miss with very minor damage caused, but they did end up with a bunch of the fighters from the first strike chasing after them, thus reducing the escort strength of the 1st Japanese Strike Force. Their report did not, however, manage to reach the officers aboard the US carriers, with Enterprise's action report noting that at 1440, the Rougeau, 1 heavy cruiser and 3 destroyers were sighted bearing 317 degrees, distance 198 miles from our position at that time. The report of this contact was not received by Enterprise until 1548. This was probably due to it being drowned out by fighter director transmission in the same general frequency band, and to the high level of local interference developed around this frequency when the ship is making high speed. At 1500, 2 carriers, 4 heavy cruisers, 6 light cruisers, and at least 8 destroyers were sighted bearing 340 degrees, distance 198 miles, from our position at that time. Report of this was not received by Enterprise, probably for the same reasons that delayed reception of the report above. Also at about the same time, Saratoga's strike arrived above Rougeau, along with some B-17s who made a valiant, if ineffective, attempt at level bombing. The 38 carrier planes were mostly Dauntless dive bombers, but with some of the shiny new Avenger torpedo bombers also along for the fun. The long range had precluded a fighter escort, with Rougeau having a minimal combat air patrol and a relatively small anti-aircraft battery. The strike managed 3 hits with 1,000-pound bombs, plus probably a torpedo, which knocked out all of the starboard machinery. Despite being well aflame from the bomb hits, Rougeau's damage control teams did an excellent job in putting out the fires, helped no doubt by the lack of aircraft on board, and the double hangar, which meant that most of the damage was limited to this upper and more lightly built structure as the bomb's fuses initiated upon impact. Unfortunately, the same thing could not be said for the flooding. Being a relatively small carrier, it didn't take long for the rising water to disable all of her port-side machinery as well, and within a couple of hours the order to abandon ship was given, with the ship then capsizing a few hours after the crew had been removed, leaving over a dozen of her planes in the air, who were then forced to ditch near the escorts. Only half of those pilots would be rescued. By 4 o'clock, the one sighting of the Japanese fleet carriers had still not come through, and so the US forces still had no clear idea where any of the other Japanese carriers were. But radar had given them a pretty good idea about where the first major Japanese attack wave was, heading right for them. The North Carolina's new radar set had a maximum detection range of 180 miles and showed considerably more information than some of the older equipment, which included the range and bearing to the targets, plus their altitude. Fletcher's instincts had been spot on, and he had 25 of Enterprise's and Saratoga's fighters already in the air, with another 20 fighters ready on deck on Saratoga, ready to launch on a moment's notice and intercept the now vastly outnumbered Japanese. In the aftermath of Midway, the US had added an additional squadron of fighters to each of its carriers, and overall 53 fighters were now up in the skies, with a few more having been brought up from below. Unluckily though, US Navy fighter direction was still quite limited at this point, with everything going over a single channel, which, as Enterprise's report indicated earlier, quickly became heavily overloaded, and between this and a heroic effort by the handful of remaining Zeros that were still on escort duty, most of the dive bombers were at least able to begin their attack runs somewhat unmolested. Enterprise's log recorded, after the initial contact between RVF, i.e. fighters, and the enemy, the radio discipline was bad. At many times 2 or more pilots were trying to talk simultaneously, and much of the traffic was non-essential. The air was so jammed with these unnecessary transmissions that in spite of numerous efforts to quiet the pilots, few directions reached our fighters, and little information was received by the fighter director officer. It is the impression in Enterprise that the radio discipline of Enterprise's fighters was better than that of Saratoga's fighters, probably because of special caution given to all pilots that day. It must be expected that this confusion described here will always develop where there has not been ample opportunity to develop radio discipline by the use of the radio in drills. Compounding this problem, both carriers' flight decks had also had armed and fueled strike aircraft who, like their Japanese Navy counterparts, had been waiting on a hair trigger for a sighting of the enemy ships. But thanks to the radar warning and some quick thinking on the carrier's part, these had all been rapidly launched well before the Japanese aircraft arrived overhead. Rather than clutter the airspace with waddling, loaded friendlies, the Dauntlesses and Avengers were told to fly north and sink anything they saw, and if they didn't see anything, at least wait until the carriers signalled that it was safe to come back. Dogged by the somewhat late-arriving Wildcats, the Vals streaked down, mostly towards the Enterprise, on the basis of her being the nearest target, and that it was better to get a big strike in on one target than try and split and hit both, with a few aircraft that went for Saratoga having to fight their way through increasing clouds of F-4Fs. A few mostly unengaged Vals decided to make that run anyway, but over on Enterprise things weren't looking good. Between the fighters and the best efforts of her anti-aircraft crews, 9 Vals would drop their bombs and 9 bombs would miss, albeit that one near miss caused a bit of damage to the stern. But the next line of Japanese aircraft corrected that mistake with 2 hits less than 30 seconds and 30 feet apart near the aft elevator, followed by another hit shortly thereafter. The first bomb did the most damage, punching down through multiple decks and exploding largely amongst the provisions and stores areas. The next hit detonated inside the hangar, but this was largely empty, its main damage being to detonate some of the charges on a nearby 5-inch anti-aircraft gun, with total casualties between the 2 hits amounting to 74 killed and slightly more than that wounded. The last bomb suffered only a partial detonation, managing to blow a 10-foot hole in the flight deck next to the amidships elevator, but, thanks to the decision to fly off all of the strike aircraft, likewise did little else. Enterprise reported, "It is doubtful that 2 bombs exploding anywhere else in the ship could have caused such large numbers of casualties as the ones which hit the ship near number 3 elevator. The explosion in the gun gallery pocket was virtually at the focal centre of the gun gallery and killed all personnel present on that battery. The explosion in the 3rd deck compartment resulted in nearly all of the remaining casualties, as it occurred amidst another unavoidable personnel concentration, which included personnel in the elevator pump room, a subdivision of a repair party, and an ammunition handling party." Seeing the plumes of fire and smoke issuing from the Enterprise caused some of the Vals to break off and go after the North Carolina instead, assuming that Enterprise was done for. This didn't avail them of much, except for the experience of being bracketed by the 2 capital ships' anti-aircraft fire, along with the cruisers Portland and Atlanta, plus still more Wildcats, and unsurprisingly, they were all shot down. Atlanta in particular was noted out for praise, as it seemed to spend most of the action apparently on fire from stem to stern. But the ship hadn't actually been hit, that was just the cumulative gun flashes of her many 5-inch 38 caliber twin mounts, as well as the other light anti-aircraft guns aboard, spraying ammunition into the sky for all that they were worth. This defensive barrage was added to by Lucky, Atlanta's dog, who decided to spend the assault barking furiously in what one assumes were canine curses at the Japanese Navy pilots. The Japanese forces peeled away, believing that they'd badly hit 2 carriers, likely due to confusion from the attempted attacks on Saratoga, but they'd paid a heavy price. 25 out of 37 aircraft, or 77% of their strike force, would not be coming back. This casualty level was perhaps unsurprising, given that Enterprise alone had expended over 14,000 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition in various calibers, primarily 20mm Oerlikon rounds, not accounting for any of the other ships or indeed the fighters. Thanks to the last 7 Val's decision to go after the North Carolina, Enterprise's crew had been able to fight the fires, which were confined to the aft end of the ship, and after a couple of hours of hard and hot work, the ship was able to receive aircraft again. All the hits had been on the starboard side, which technically left enough space to land returning planes on the port side of the flight deck, even if the holes hadn't been quickly patched with sheet metal brought up from the hold, but since they had, that issue didn't arise. There would be some extra drama to be had, though. Partway through recovering the aircraft, the water and foam that had been used to fight the fires percolated its way down into the steering room, flooding the steering motor and leaving the Enterprise sailing in a circle to starboard, frankly signalling to all the escorting ships to get out of the way as the exhausted crew hunted around for a pump to clear the room, and then an engineer who could get the motor working again, and when that failed, start up the backup steering motor. Despite almost 100 more aircraft from both sides being in the air, that was pretty much it as far as the major fighting was concerned. The second wave of Japanese aircraft were unable to find the US carriers and had to go back, despite coming within 50 miles of them and actually being seen from Enterprise's bridge. The US strike aircraft, without a clear vector for the Japanese carriers, largely didn't find anything either, except for a couple of Dauntlesses who did manage to find the seaplane carrier Chitose, damaging it with a couple of near misses. With their aircraft recovered, either to Henderson Field or back to the carriers themselves as night fell, Fletcher took his ship south at speed. Much as at Midway, he surmised that the Japanese surface units would try and close for a night surface action, and he was correct. As a result, the Japanese heavy ships sailed on through the darkness, but found nothing, turning back around midnight so as not to be vulnerable to US counter-air assault themselves. With their air groups badly diminished, the two Japanese fleet carriers withdrew north as well, whilst 5 destroyers sneaked in to shell Henderson Field by night, something which would develop over the next few months into what one man stationed at Henderson Field would describe as a bad habit he really wished they'd learn to break. Thus, believing that the US had no operational carriers left in the area, the troop transports headed towards Guadalcanal, but would come under air attack from Henderson Field's aircraft, who hadn't been as badly affected as the night bombardment had hoped, sinking one of the transports and a destroyer whilst badly damaging another. The destroyer that was sunk being a rare example of level bombing aircraft hitting a ship at sea, albeit that it was a stationary one. This forced the troop convoy to withdraw again. Whilst the Japanese reinforcements were thus further delayed, they would eventually be sent in on faster destroyers, having been forced to leave most of their heavy equipment that were on the troop transports themselves behind. Henderson Field's aircraft would go on to exact a heavy toll of the Japanese Navy over the rest of the campaign. Overall, the battle had ended clearly in the US Navy's favour. Whilst the Enterprise would need repairs, the fleet was down less than 24 aircraft and less than 100 dead, few of whom were pilots. Conversely, the Japanese Navy was down a light carrier, a destroyer, and a transport, with 2 other ships damaged and several hundred dead, but more critically, almost half of the naval aircraft committed to the action were lost, along with most of their scarcely replaceable veteran pilots. In keeping with the various actions of the Guadalcanal Campaign, although they came out of this particular fight in substantially better shape than they did at the First Battle of Savo Island, the US Navy still came away with a long list of issues that they wanted to see improved. And it bears listening to, as it would be easy to see this battle as simply a continuation of the victory won at Midway, but the US Navy's officers were putting serious thought into how they could improve, even when the day's outcome had been in their favour. Some of the recommendations put forward in the Enterprise's after-action report are as follows. 1. Communications. Part A. Once again, as in the past in the Coral Sea and at Midway, communications have been shown to be weak to the point of danger. Due to lack of proper training, reporting pilots in all commands continue to transmit vague, ambiguous, and confusing contact reports, frequently omitting several of the vital components of a complete contact report and often failing to continue to report. B. Lack of discipline in the matter of radio transmission by aircraft in contact with the enemy has been the subject of detailed comment by the Fighter Director Officer in Enclosure F. Radio silence should not be imposed on such occasions because responsible leaders of flights can and should furnish valuable information to Fighter Director Officers and to the task force commanders, but there should be little necessity for interplane transmission except by the squadron and division commanders, and this should be limited to the minimum necessary for the prosecution of the attack. The intolerable confusion caused by unrestrained transmission is difficult to eliminate, for war conditions reduce to zero the experience prior to the action of the majority of pilots in the use of voice radio. There can and must be improvement, however. C. An even more serious fault in existing communications was the delay in receipt of contact reports which originated with our shore and tender-based aircraft. Sometimes as many as 6 to 12 hours elapsed from the time of contact to the time of receipt of the report of contact by the interested commander, even though such reports were in the urgent priority category. D. In the manner of finding, accurately reporting the position of, and tracking units and groups of enemy forces, we suffer by comparison with the enemy. With the development of radar by the Japanese for fighter direction, the present effectiveness of our seaplane scouts and patrols will be reduced. In the future, these vital operations will require fast, long-range airplanes with heavy defensive armament. In other words, the Navy must have large numbers of land plane bomber-type aircraft on which it has first call and complete control. 2. Steering casualty. The steering casualty, which occurred at 1850 on August 24th following the attack by enemy dive bombers and resulting indirectly therefrom, was most serious. Had conditions been only slightly worse, this casualty might easily have led to the loss of the ship. As it was, the ship was forced to steam in a circle for 38 minutes whilst control was being regained. It is recommended that A. The ventilation and cooling of the steering engine room be improved as covered by Enclosure C, and B. That means of freeing the rudder from the steering gear, preferably remotely controlled, be provided in order that the rudder may be brought amidships and the ship steered by its engines in the event of an irreparable casualty to the steering engine or gear. 3. Air Group Personnel. Part A. Shortly before sailing on the current mission, the Enterprise Air Group was formed of hastily collected remnants of squadrons from 3 previously existing air groups. The majority of the pilots were very inexperienced, and although an intensive last-minute training schedule was conducted, the time available was definitely insufficient for adequate progress. Except for the fighting squadron, the state of gunnery and bombing proficiency of the group when it embarked was extremely low, and the group had not had the opportunity to become a cohesive striking unit. B. Although every opportunity to train was utilised during passage to the Coral Sea, with much obvious improvement, and although there was much more training opportunity than could normally be expected after a task force departs on a specific mission, the lack of gunnery training and indoctrination of the group as a whole was keenly felt. This condition obtained to a lesser degree in the fighting squadron, which had more previous training than the others, and which in the preliminary and final engagements accounted for the destruction of a large number of enemy aircraft while sustaining relatively small losses itself. C. These conditions are pointed out in no spirit of criticism, for it is realised that the need for the best possible preparedness and training of carrier air groups is recognised by all concerned. The demands of the strategic situation, coupled with an unavoidably inadequate initial backlog of trained carrier squadrons, have almost literally left us no choice in the matter to date. D. Nevertheless, it cannot be too often reiterated nor too strongly stressed that conditions that have had to be accepted to date are really serious, and that we must take care not to underestimate the vital urgency of improvement. E. The squadron should not be considered a separate entity which may be shifted from one group to another at will. The group should be the unit, and no group should normally be sent aboard a carrier for active combat with the enemy until it has had at least 4 months of intensive gunnery, tactical and scouting training as a unit, and in an area in which training is not unduly interfered with by the necessity for security and defensive measures. This can be termed old stuff. It is very true, however. The sooner it is possible to do it, the sooner we shall become not merely more effective, but enormously more effective in both offence and defence. Meanwhile, employment of a carrier in combat areas with less than the best possible air group can be justified only by the most urgent strategic demands, and the possible price of merely average effectiveness or even less must not only be accepted, but recognised. Item 4. Identification, friend or foe. The performance of IFF equipment in all planes, both shore-based and carrier-based, is generally unsatisfactory. There results an excessive number of false reports of enemy aircraft and reports of unidentified aircraft which must be considered enemy until investigated. This causes unnecessary fighter direction transmission, fighter investigation, time loss, and reduction in effectiveness of combat patrols. The condition has a deleterious effect upon the alertness and fighting efficiency. The fault with the IFF is not known. If it is one of maintenance, then suitable maintenance instructions should be issued and personnel properly trained. If the fault is one of design, other or modified equipment should be procured. This is of the highest urgency. Part 5. Anti-aircraft protection. The fire control radar in Enterprise was ineffective. It is not known whether or not other vessels in the task force obtained acceptable results from their corresponding equipment, but the fact remains that no 5-inch fire from any vessel in the task force was commenced while the enemy aircraft were at the high altitudes at which these guns were the only ones having the necessary range. The 5-inch fire was commenced only after that of Enterprise's small caliber weapons, and after the first attacking planes were in their dives. B. Unquestionably, the personal element looms large in the operation of the fire control radar, and improved results can be obtained with additional training. It has been reported, however, that the fire control radar equipment is of extreme sensitiveness and requires the reasonably accurate predetermination by other means of range, elevation, and azimuth in order to pick up the target. If this is to a degree which is not likely to be possible of attainment in the tense, hurried atmosphere prior to and during battle, the existing equipment should be replaced with other equipment that can fulfill its purpose under all conditions. C. Supporting vessels cannot wholly protect an aircraft carrier from a determined dive-bombing attack from high altitude, and their fire is apt to be less effective than the carrier herself due to deflection problems. The 20mm guns, whilst probably the most effective anti-aircraft guns against dive bombers, have not sufficient range to prevent determined attacking planes from reaching an effective release point. Well-trained 20mm batteries can, however, prevent low releases and can take a heavy toll in attacking dive bombers which pull out at low altitudes. The 20mm gun is considered to be a generally excellent and effective weapon, and it is recommended that these guns be installed in every available space on all ships. Well-directed fighting planes in large numbers still remain the most effective defense against attack by enemy aircraft. 6. Torpedo planes. As previously stated, not one enemy torpedo plane penetrated our fighter screen to reach its dropping point. This, together with our own heavy torpedo plane losses in the Battle of Midway, indicates the vulnerability of this type in good visibility against adequate fighter defense. It may be, therefore, that serious consideration should be given to torpedo plane use of the carrier torpedo bomber only under special favourable conditions such as moonlight, low visibility, or for finishing off cripples. B. On the other hand, there has not yet been any real test of our new torpedo bomber, the TBF. Its superiority in speed, manoeuvrability, armour and armament to both enemy torpedo planes and our own earlier versions of this type may produce quite different results. This is more likely if the torpedo plane attack is well handled, with good timing, coordination and fighter protection. Furthermore, the superiority of the torpedo attack over high-altitude bombing, both in accuracy and damage effect, is so great that torpedo plane use should not be limited on the basis of experience to date. C. Tests to date would appear to offer promise of relatively high accuracy of our torpedo bomber when used as a glide bomber instead of a horizontal bomber. It is recommended that this development be continued in view of the limited accuracy of horizontal bombing against a manoeuvring target, and because of the weight reduction that will be possible if glide bombing can be profitably substituted for horizontal bombing as a torpedo bomber mission. D. The TBF plane, because of its size and weight, is at present a serious potential liability on board aircraft carriers. Too large a number can reduce flight and hangar deck flexibility and slow up flight deck operations at crucial times. A TBF crash on deck can be handled only after long delay, and this might well be fatal under certain conditions. It is recommended that the total number of TBF planes in a carrier of the Enterprise type be limited to 12, resultant space being used for fighters and scout bombers, and that crane tractors capable of hoisting a TBF be provided immediately for all carriers operating this type of plane. The latter recommendation is of urgent importance. 7. A. The rates of elevation and train of the 1.1-inch mounts should be further increased. B. It is recommended that 1.1-inch gun mounts number 1 and 2 be moved further forward, and mounts number 3 and 4 further aft in order to increase the unobstructed arcs of fire of these guns to port. And C. It is recommended that additional 20mm guns be installed in every suitable available space at the earliest practicable date. The report does go on at length about other issues, but those are the main ones, and you can appreciate from that there was quite the substantial list that Enterprise's officers believed necessary to further improve the fighting capability of their vessel, and you'll probably recognise a good number of those recommendations were implemented in fairly short order. For the moment, though, both sides' carriers would be away from the action. One soldier on Guadalcanal observing that Everyone is withdrawing but the Marines. The next major battle of the campaign would thus be another nighttime cruiser clash, the Second Battle of Savo Island.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.